What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Jeff Wetzler, and you can check them out at askapproach.com. The book Ask will talk about, and also his experience, long experience in the education and also Transcend education as well. And Jeff, before I formally introduce you, I always like to mention other episodes people should check out of the podcast. Since this is part of the author series, you could check out some other ones. Did one with Gino Wickman of Traction. That was a good episode. Michael Gerber wrote The E-Myth. That was also an interesting one. John Warlow wrote Built to Sell. And Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference, which is also a popular one. And David Allen of Getting Things Done. So those episodes are really good. It's, they're 45 minutes, an hour. And I don't know, Jeff, I consider it kind of like a book summary if people can get like a taste of the best story so that they can tackle the book itself. So check those episodes out. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. And how do we do that? We do that by helping you run your podcast. We're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, the accountability, and the full execution. So Jeff, we call ourselves the magic elves that run in the background that make it look easy for the host and the company so they can create amazing content, create amazing relationships, and most importantly, run their business. For me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I found no better way over the past decade to profile the people and companies I most admire and share with the world what they're working on. So if you thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com to learn more. Email us support at rise25.com. I'm excited to introduce Jeff Wetzler. He's been on this quest for a quarter century to transform learning opportunities. He is the author of Ask. Ask is you tap into the hidden wisdom of people around you for unexpected breakthroughs in leadership and life. And the book blends a unique set of leadership experiences in the fields of business and education. He's actually pursued this quest as a management consultant to the world's top corporations, as a learning facilitator for leaders around the world, as the chief learning officer at Teach for America, and also as co-CEO of Transcend, which is a nationally recognized innovation organization. Jeff, thanks for joining me.
It's great to be with you, Jeremy.
Now, for people listening, there is a video version, and I'm going to pull up. We're going to take a look here. We could see Ask right here. Talk a little bit about Amy Edmondson and the forward of the book.
Absolutely. Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard Business School. She studies organizational behavior. She is probably best known for her work on psychological safety. And psychological safety plays a big role in the book. And some of her most important findings are that if you want people in organizations to feel free to share their truth, to admit mistakes, to communicate openly with one another, they've got to feel psychologically safe. That means that they cannot fear consequences or punishment for being who they are and speaking their truth. The more that people feel safe, the more that you're going to have truth-telling, honesty, learning happening in organizations. She's a true hero of mine. She actually just came out with her latest book called The Right Kind of Wrong, which is all about how can we orient to mistakes and failure in productive ways, in ways that actually generate learning and optimism and better performance. So I encourage people to check out her book too.
And you could see here, there's this question mark, and we can go through some of these things. There's choose curiosity, make it safe, pose quality questions, listen to learn, reflect, and connect. Let's stay on make it safe for a second. Yes. I'm sure you get called into organizations and, it kind of goes back to culture, right? So how do you go into organizations that maybe the culture isn't making it safe for people and how they should navigate that?
Yeah, so I'll maybe I can answer that question first with a story of my own experience as a leader. This was one of my early experiences as an operating line leader, where I had hundreds of people on my team, and we were overseeing major events throughout the country. And on one of those teams, things were not going well, and it was a very high stakes event. And all year long, I was very curious. I thought I was asking all the right questions, and I discovered almost too late that it was about to blow up, that things were about to go off the rails. And what I realized, later, was that people didn't feel safe actually telling me the challenges and struggles that they were having, which was a real problem because I could have helped. I really could have, made a difference, et cetera. Instead, they were trying to solve it all themselves and make sure that I felt confident in them and in their leadership, et cetera. And so I learned a really hard lesson, but an important lesson, that if you actually want people to make it, to tell you the truth, they've got to feel safe, which means that they've got to feel like you're not going to judge them or punish them, or it's not going to tank your relationship with them for them to tell the truth. And I further learned that is extra important when you're crossing lines of difference, whether there's power differences involved, or people, in that case, I had more authority, but also differences in any other kinds of identity markers, whether, gender, race, language, background, et cetera. And so making it safe is really about confronting that reality by creating a level of connection with people that helps them to feel much more comfortable. Often that connection has to be on their terms and on their turf, and not on what's going to make me comfortable, but what's going to make them comfortable. It's about myself opening up, and letting them know, here's why I'm asking you those questions. Here's my own agenda, so you don't have to guess. Maybe even here's a struggle I've had, or something that makes me feel vulnerable, so that they can see it's okay to go there. And it's also about what I call radiating resilience, which is to let them know, to demonstrate, to express that I can handle what they have to say. I'm not going to crumble. I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to take it out on them. And so those strategies of creating connection on their terms, opening up myself, radiating resilience, are all part of what any individual can do in an organization. And I would say, back to your question, even if an organization has a broader culture that is not as safe, if individual people, whether they're in leadership roles or really in any roles in the organization, and I truly believe that anybody in an organization can be in a leadership, can exert leadership no matter where you sit in the organization. If you take those steps and follow those strategies, you're going to increase the safety of people around you.
What you just said, Jeff, is really concerning, because you seem like a really friendly, open person. So if they weren't comfortable with you,
that's what I thought. I thought,
yeah.
Look at me. I mean, it's just me. Why would you be intimidated by me? Why would you feel, like I'm my own, insecure person, and I've got my own, like, who would possibly be intimidated by me? But I had it all wrong. Even just being in a certain position creates a level of power dynamic, let alone all the other aspects of difference and identity that I was just learning about at the time.
So some of the things you said, do you incorporate them now proactively? Like you mentioned a couple things like sharing a struggle.
Yes.
What are some of the things you do now differently? Because, I would see you as, okay, I could go to this person and be open, but
yeah,
obviously some people didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the first thing is, I don't assume that people are going to feel comfortable. I assume I have to earn their trust, which means that if there's going to be a time that I'm going to need to learn from them or ask them important questions, et cetera, I can't wait for that time to build our connection. I've got to build our connection way in advance. One of my mentors used an expression at one point that he said, dig your well before you're thirsty. And so if I'm thirsty to learn from them, I got to dig that well of relationships, for weeks, months, years in advance beforehand. So that's one of the things that I do. And then I would say a second thing that I do is I really try to reveal why I'm asking questions. So many people will make up stories and guess how he must be asking because he's getting ready to fire me, or he must be asking because he wants to cut or whatever. Usually I'm just asking because I want to learn from them and I'm curious. And so stating that in advance so that they don't have to guess is a second thing that I really try to do quite often.
What would be one example of something that you asked that they may be suspect over?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the simplest things is a question of how come we do it this way? If I'm working with a team of mine and I'm watching how we're doing something, and I think to myself, I don't know that I would have thought to do it that way. by
And
just
they think you're questioning their
they think
methods.
like, well, that's dumb. What, I'm thinking like they think Jeff must think that's dumb, or Jeff must think that's a bad idea, or whatever. But if I were to say to them, that's really interesting, I never would have thought to do it that way. I'd love to learn more about that. Tell me more how you're thinking about it that way. It has a completely different tone and impact.
Do you ever get the scenario of the flip side where there's a scenario where you make it's people don't feel safe and they're not telling things, or you do have that environment of making it safe and then they're coming to you too much, whereas you want them to figure it out yourself?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think like anything in life, things can be taken to an extreme. If I had to choose between one or the other, I would choose to have them come to me too much versus not enough. But when they come to me, I can then say to them, that's a great thing to think through. Let me offer you a suggestion, which is that you can take some of these steps beforehand and then come to me, at a different point in the process. And so there's a way to say that that I think can still preserve the psychological safety while not having it overswing so much.
Is there an example or story that sticks out when you evaluate and you ask that, how come we do it this way, that actually changed the process for the better?
Absolutely. And I'll go back to a scenario where I had been managing a big organization nationally, and we had instituted a set of processes to set goals and kind of monitor progress. And every person and then the person they were supervising had their goal and their trackers and all, their metrics and all that kind of thing. And it was working well in the sense of it was helping us grow and keep a hold on quality, but it was starting to dampen morale. People were like going along with the process technically, but we were not unleashing their actual inner visions and their drive and their fulfillment and why they actually came to it. And so we called a timeout and we said, let's name what we're seeing here. Here's what's working, but here's really what's not working. And this is part of opening up and to say like that, I think I've contributed to the problem by creating this. Let's talk about why we do it this way, but also let's talk about what might be some different ways to do it. And I actually think you all who are on the front lines are going to have better ideas for how to do this than any of us are going to do. So in addition to talking about why we're doing it this way and what we want to preserve and what we're getting, I use a strategy that I write about in the book that's simply called invite ideas. And by inviting ideas, you can actually tap into the collective intelligence of a team or an organization. And the ideas that we came up with were not to throw away all the goals and trackers and measures, but to anchor them in more of a qualitative vision that each person got to articulate. And that qualitative vision became the North Star that motivated them, even while they were keeping an eye on the progress. That's an idea I never would have personally thought of. But because we actually had that conversation, we asked, why are we doing it this way? And what can we be doing differently? We unleashed an amazing amount of energy in the organization and performance.
Yeah, I feel like we need to do a lot more of that and a better job of just challenging why. Because at one point we may have done something for a certain reason and things may have changed, right? And reevaluating why we do it this way anymore. And is there a better way now?
Especially because the world is changing so fast. So even if it worked last year, there doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, but the world's changing. And so we got to reevaluate it. And that requires asking questions.
What made you decide to write this book in the first place? You're super busy. You have a million things on your plate. And then you say, I'm going to write a book.
So the biggest reason that I wrote it is because the problem that the book is trying to solve, I think, is pervasive. I see it everywhere. And maybe just to back up and state what that problem is, all of us as leaders, as individuals, as just human beings in life are surrounded by people. Those could be our customers, clients, investors, bosses, people we manage, friends, family, et cetera. We're surrounded by people who know things. They have ideas. They have feedback for us. They have perspectives. They have life experiences that are incredibly valuable. But far too often, we actually don't hear what they have to say, or we don't hear all of what they have to say. And the reason we don't hear it is very simply, they don't tell us. And when they don't tell us and we don't find out, we pay a cost. We don't make as good decisions. We don't innovate as well. We waste time. Our relationships are more distant. So I saw this problem was everywhere. And as you can probably tell from the stories I've already shared, I personally experienced this problem and paid those costs myself. But I also saw that it didn't have to be this way. And in the work you referenced, where I started my career for about a decade at a management consulting company called Monitor Group, had a number of amazing mentors, including Diana Smith, Jamie Higgins, Jim Cutler, a bunch of other people, all who were disciples of someone named Chris Argyris, who really created this body of work. He was an organizational psychologist and worked with Monitor, worked at Harvard Business School. And he developed a set of tools and resources that my mentors kind of refined and shared with me, and then gave me the opportunity to share with people all around the world. And I saw over and over again how when people could embrace these tools, it would literally change everything. They would say, like, it was life-changing to me. Even now, as I'm promoting the book and going back to people, they would say things. I'm getting emails that say, like, I will never forget that day that we spent together because everything changed after that. So this stuff was so powerful. And I thought, if this problem is pervasive and these tools and ideas are powerful, can I put them together and essentially pay it forward? And I wanted to basically, help other people get access to what I found and what others have found to be some of the most important set of ideas.
Jeff, what was one of those times where you look back and someone said everything changed because of that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so picture a workshop full of smart, successful management consultants who, went to had the best training in schools and all that kind of stuff. Which, incidentally, Chris Argyris, who was the originator of some of this stuff, often found that those kind of people were the worst at learning from other people. It's the smartest, most successful people who have been rewarded for having answers, as opposed to for asking questions and things like that. And so, picture, let's just say, one person in that room who is telling a story and bringing what we called a case into the conversation about a really challenging interaction that they had with a client. And in those cases, we would have them literally recount the dialogue. Pick a 5-minute snippet and say, I said this, she said this, I said this, she said this. And then on the left-hand side of the paper, jot down all the things that you were thinking and feeling, but not telling your client at that time. We called that the left-hand column. And so that was like a window into the stories that they were telling themselves. And at the end, they would say, this client was just impossible. They would not at all listen to our recommendations. We kept telling them why they needed to close these 3 factories. We kept telling them all this, and all they would do is just play politics with us, et cetera. And so, this person's incredibly frustrated, but also failing in their job because they're not actually, making change. And so we would take a look at their dialogue. And the first thing that we would do in taking a look at the dialogue is a very simple scoring. We would just say, count the ratio of statements that you make to questions that you ask. So they'd look down the dialogue, and all of a sudden they would have this shock and say, oh my God, I never asked my client a single question. All I did was tell them what I thought the right answer was. And when they started pushing back, I just repeated myself, or I gave them more data points or whatever. And what I never learned is, why do they disagree with my answer? What other ideas do they have? What's the history in their organization that I never had? And it's like a life-changing moment to realize I'm stuck, but I'm causing my own stuckness because all I'm doing is asserting things and never inquiring. And so from there, we would often go to, that's interesting. What would happen if you ask questions? What might be some questions you would ask them? And the kinds of questions that they and the group would come up with were just simple but incredibly powerful questions that they thought to themselves, I could totally ask this question. I could see how it would make a huge difference. But then we would peel the layer back one more and say, chances are it's not random that you didn't ask any questions. What was the story that you had going on about yourself and your client that prevented you from asking any questions? And the story was usually some form of, I'm right, they're wrong. My job is to convince them that I'm right and they're wrong. And so then we would ask the question, well, how come that was your story? What led you to have the story that trapped you inside the certainty so much that you couldn't even ask a question authentically? And that's where some of the deepest kind of ahas would be, which is, why would I construct a reality that makes it that is blind to the fact that I'm missing so much? Why would I not be curious about that? And then that starts to open up a level of curiosity. And then what we would do is play out, all right, now with this more curious story and with this more balanced set of assertions and questions, how could the conversation go? And usually it would go dramatically differently. And then people would come back and, at the next workshop and report, I had a complete breakthrough in my relationship with my client. And by the way, also a complete breakthrough in the relationship with my husband too, because I realized I was doing the same thing in my personal life as well. So is that helpful as a story?
Very helpful. And that kind of, actually solidifies why choose curiosity is in the very beginning.
Yes.
Because it really it basically urges people to ask those questions and be curious. How did you help people? Because they had a mental headspace around and baggage maybe around like having the answers, being right, and convincing them so that they could actually step into what you want people to do, which is choose curiosity.
Yes. How did we help them choose curiosity? Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to reinforce what you're saying, which is there's a very important reason why choose curiosity comes first, which is that if you just try to pose questions, but you're not very curious authentically, people will see right through that. It will not work. And conversely, if you're genuinely curious, even if you fumble with the right question, if that authentic intention of learning from someone comes through, they're going to want to engage with you naturally. So the way that we helped people choose curiosity is to start by understanding how they got so certain in the first place. And so we used a tool that in the book I call the ladder of understanding, which comes from Chris Argyris, which basically says that whenever we walk into any kind of situation in life, as human beings, we are surrounded by, I would say, thousands, if not millions of data points. What's this person doing? What's the temperature in the room? What's the color that's happening here? What did this other person say? What's the latest sales data? Like just, gajillions of data points. And if we were to try to pay attention to all of those data points, we would go crazy. Just think about a toddler walking down the street who stops and looks at every single thing. I mean, they're literally paying attention to every data point, and it's cute, but you can't get anywhere. And so if we want to get somewhere, we've got to select a very, very tiny slice of data points and basically ignore the rest of this. And by the way, this happens in split seconds. We don't even notice that we're doing it. Once we select those data points, we immediately start to infer things about them. We make it mean something. We tell ourselves a story about something. And in Chris Argyris' language, this means we're racing up the ladder of understanding. And so all of a sudden we get to a conclusion, which is a very certain conclusion, but it's based on just the tiniest slice of data. And incidentally, the choice we make about what data to select in the first place and how to interpret that data, that's also not random. That is colored by our pre-existing biases and assumptions and worldviews and ways of being, et cetera. And so what we would do is literally map that out. We would say to someone, all right, let's go through your story. What was the data point that you selected? What did you make it mean? What conclusion did you reach, et cetera? And then we would say, now let's just pause for a second and say, what other data points might have been out there? What other ways of interpreting those data points might there have been? And this is where it's really helpful to do it in the context with a group of colleagues who are both challenging but also supportive. And all of a sudden, what happens is you start to inject question marks. You say, wow, you know what? I never thought that maybe there was these other three things that were happening in the client organization that could have also been going on that I overlooked. Or maybe a different way to interpret the fact that the sales data was slipping isn't just that we should close the factories, but there's some other cyclicality that I never thought of, or things like that. And the person who had that otherwise certain story all of a sudden has a lot of question marks in their story, and question marks to the point where they actually want to go find out and learn some things. Does that help?
Yeah. So for the ladder of understanding, you want to go up the ladder fast, but not too fast.
Well, yes, I will. And in some ways you can't help it because as a human being, you're going to go up fast, but you want to go up in a conscious way. You want to be able to notice these are the steps that I took. And then also say to yourself, let me walk myself back down and realize, what if I selected a different data point? What might I not even realize is a data point? What is a different way to go?
Yeah, I love that because I am very guilty of that. I was guilty of that yesterday, of just like making a snap conclusion when my co-founder made a suggestion. And it's very easy, at least for me, just to go into that doesn't sound right type of thing, and not ask questions, and to get to something that may work out better in the end.
I was guilty of it yesterday myself. My wife said to me, she was telling me about a conversation she had with our son who's trying to make some decisions about where to go to college and whether to do a gap year and all that kind of stuff. And I just said, that's a terrible idea. He should never do that.
I mean, you've been Teach for America for 10 years, you've been in the education space for decades. So but yeah,
I just jumped right to the top of my ladder. For that split second, I was not curious. And my wife gently but but firmly reminded me perhaps I should, take a step back, be a little more curious, be a little less controlling. And
Like, have you read this book?
have you read this book? Exactly. I mean, honestly, I wrote the book as much for myself as a reminder as for anybody else, because I say I'm a student of this, not an expert who's perfect at it.
So choose curiosity. I could see that part. Make it safe. I love that story. And the next is pose quality questions.
Yes.
What are some thoughts and things that people can do? Because I know with that, you want to help people uncover what's most important to people.
Exactly. So my definition of a quality question is very simple. It's a question that helps us learn something important from somebody else. And I distinguish quality questions from crummy questions, because there's a lot of what passes as a question, which might be something that we say that has a question mark at the end of it, that is not really a quality question. Those could be clumsy questions, which are just like, sometimes we ask 7 questions in a row and then the other person doesn't know which one to answer, or we don't know which one they're answering. It could be a sneaky question where we're actually not really asking a question, but we're trying to maneuver someone to get to our answer, which usually leads people to feel manipulated. It could be an attack question that usually leads people to feel hurt. Those are all crummy questions. Quality questions I think about almost the same way that I imagine a surgeon might think about their scalpel and all of the precision tools that they have. Depending on what it is that we're trying to learn, we can draw from particular questions. And so in the book, I introduce a taxonomy of different kinds of questions, especially questions that we may overlook, but are incredibly powerful. So I'll just give you a couple examples. Well, one we talked about earlier, which is invite ideas. Saying to somebody else, here's my dilemma. Do you have any advice? How else might we try to do this? What might what might be a way forward here? And just that's just really inviting other people to share how they think things could go, what ideas they have there. And oftentimes people will not share those ideas unless we ask them, either because they think we don't want them, or maybe they think their ideas are too crazy. So inviting ideas is a really powerful one. I think one of the most overlooked ones is what I call request reactions. And so requesting reactions is simply to say to somebody, what's your reaction to what I just said? How did that land with you? What does that make you think? Is there, what might I have overlooked? And so often, whenever we state our opinion, we assume that if someone has a reaction to it, they're going to tell us their reaction to it. And some people will, but a lot of people, especially if they're not feeling 100% safe, are not going to tell us their reaction to it. And so, just to give you one story, when I was early in my career managing people and had just learned this stuff, I was managing someone, and I thought we had just a great conversation where I had given him some guidance and direction for what he should do next. And I thought to myself, hey, I just went through this training. They told me I should ask someone for their reactions. So I said to him, hey, what are your reactions to what I just said? And he said to me, honestly, if you want my reaction, I'm totally demoralized by what you just told me. And I thought I had just been very helpful and given him a whole bunch of guidance. And had I not asked that question, he would have just walked away feeling demoralized, probably not done a good job, probably not been motivated. But because I asked the question, we could get to the root of what was going on, which was just that we had a miscommunication. We were making different assumptions about what we were supposed to be doing. We cleared that up. We both felt good. We were able to move forward. But I would never have been able to do that had I not asked that question.
It's amazing that 2 really smart people leave a conversation like that with totally opposite thoughts on how it went.
It happens all the time. All the time. And if we don't ask, we never know.
What was it that you're like, that was a great conversation, I gave him a lot of good advice, and the person felt demoralized? What was the kind of the background of why do you think the person felt demoralized from the conversation?
Well, what I think what he didn't know, because I actually hadn't told him at the time, but I thought I had told him, was that our client had been pushing back on us on a bunch of issues. And so he thought the client relationship was on track. And so why is Jeff saying we need to double back and go talk to the client about this and bring this extra data to the client, et cetera? Like I thought we were in good shape. I thought he knew that. Apparently I hadn't communicated that clearly enough. Once he realized that this was the thing that we had to solve for, then of course we were both on the same team wanting it to go well.
So invite ideas, request reactions, any others that
another one
quality.
I talk about a lot of times people either think they've told us what they really think or just haven't told us their true opinion about something. And so there's a sequence of question strategies that starts with what I call hear their headline, which is literally just saying to someone, what is your opinion on X? Where do you come down on this decision? What do you think about this? Just like, what is their true headline view of it? But not stopping there, because their headline views come from somewhere. And so the next strategy is what I call dig deeper, which is a little bit what you were just starting to do in your questions with me as well. What led you to think that? Where does that come from? Walk me through. How'd you get to that? Those are some, what are some of the concerns or interests or values that are motivating your point of view on this? But then I would say, don't stop at dig deeper. There's a final one, which is what I call see what they see, which is kind of get inside their head in terms of what's the information, data points, examples, experiences, stories that have led them to actually think that way. And so those could be questions simply like, what's an example of that? Or can you tell me a story about, how that played out for you that makes you concerned about that, et cetera. Sometimes people, if we ask them for data points, get intimidated because they think, well, I just have to have all my, data buttoned up on a PowerPoint slide, et cetera. But if you just say, what's a story? Everyone can tell a story.
Yeah, I could see a lot of great examples in business where this is helpful. And I could also see a lot of great examples in personal life. And is there a parenting one that sticks out to you in this regard? I'm sure there's lots of interactions, at least in my world, with my kids and other people, and helping them dig deeper and understand. Like, it really stuck out when you said, see what they see, right? Because people are reacting in their world based on their own viewpoints, their own experiences. So how have you used the quality question with your kids to help them?
Well, I mean, I have two teenagers now. I have a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old. And one of the things that I have started to appreciate, especially as they've gotten older, is that the best I can do is to be a coach to them. There's no telling them what to do. Probably there never should have been or was ever before, but like really we're in the mode of now coaching, which means that there's a lot of questions. So, because I need to understand how they're seeing the world. If I take an example of my daughter, we can actually backtrack it one step to make it safe, first of all, because when she comes home from school, I'm very interested to know, like, how was your day? What happened? All that kind of stuff. And if I say to those questions to her, I get nothing. It was fine. Leave me alone. That kind of thing. If I really want to have a conversation with her and understand what she's thinking, what she's going through, I need to do it on her terms, which means I need to stay up till 11 p.m. when she's done talking her homework and talking to her friends. But at that point in time, she's, that's when she wants to interact. And so she does.
There's a certain point in time you find that she specifically is open to interacting.
She's open to interacting with me. And that's part of the connection of making it safe. So once, then when I'm there, we can have a lot of conversations. When right now we're having conversations about what courses do I take next year in high school. And I have opinions about what I think would be good courses for her, and she has opinions. But once I'm able to ask questions like, tell me more about what leads you to be interested in that, and also what would lead you to not be interested in that. I start to get information from her, like, well, here's the reputation of the teacher of this course. And so now it's not a question of the course, it's a question of the teacher. And all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, actually, that's a really good point, because if you have a good course, but a bad teacher, that's not going to light you up. On the other hand, if it's a course that you don't necessarily think you're interested in, but the teacher has this reputation for being so passionate making other kids. And so we can start to unpack what she sees, or in this case, what she's hearing from her friends. But also questions like, I really like to have fun at school too. And so there's some courses that are just going to be really fun for me. And I get to ask questions, well, what would make that fun? And all of that is part of her thought process that I get to learn by asking these kinds of deeper questions.
It's funny because you're asking the questions, she's giving you different data points, and your ladder of understanding, you're kind of slowing down, or maybe you have jumped to, why would you take that course, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I remember I took Scandinavian literature, one of the best courses I took at Wisconsin, and people are like, why would you take? It was because of that reason. Like, the teacher was just supposed to be Amazing. So
Yeah.
I get
Yeah.
that.
And I also, in those questions, I also get a view into her ladder of understanding as well. By I get to see what's the information that she's selecting and how is she making meaning of that, and what stories is she telling herself, and so when we kind of understand this concept of the ladder of understanding, it's not only helping us get more curious about our own, but it's literally a way to understand where someone else is coming from too.
So, Jeff, we have choose curiosity, make it safe, pose quality questions. The next is listen to learn.
Yes.
What's a favorite example from listen to learn? So this is like, I mean, arguably, I know not any one is more important than the other, but like if we're asking questions and not listening, then that's a problem.
It doesn't
So,
matter. It doesn't
right.
matter how good our questions are if we don't actually listen. Most of us think we are far better at listening than we actually are. I had a chance during this conversation, during the research for this book, to interview professional listeners. So I interviewed journalists who listen for a living to the people that they write about. I remember one of them, Jenny Anderson, saying to me that she records her conversations, as many journalists do. But what she then does is listen to them over and over and over again. And she would say, every time I listen to them, I literally hear something that I hadn't heard before, something new and something important. And I think to myself, very few of us actually record our conversations and listen over and over again. Think about how much we're missing if we just hear it for the first time. In the book, I talk about we need to listen through three channels: the content of what someone's saying, the emotion of what they're actually expressing, and the actions that they're taking during the conversation. And we talk through different strategies for how to do that. To your question, I think one of the most interesting strategies comes from research and conversations I had with psychotherapists who talk about this thing called the doorknob moment, which is that oftentimes in a therapy session, and by the way, they also heard the same thing from executive coaches too. The most important thing that someone says happens on their way out the door. Like literally when they're touching the doorknob, that's when they drop the bomb of, oh yeah, I'm thinking about leaving my wife, or, oh, I'm being investigated by the government, or any number of things. And they've gone through this, almost the whole hour, not said this thing, even though they've answered a lot of questions. It's just at the very last minute. And what that says to me is that oftentimes when we ask someone a question, we assume that the answer they give is the totality of their thoughts. But really, it's not the totality. There's more to it than what they might say. And in fact, the most important thing that they have to say is often not the first thing that they're going to say when they answer a question. They might be holding that back for any number of reasons, including they might want to see, how did we react to the first thing that they said? Or maybe they're just still formulating their thoughts, or maybe they're just working up the courage to say it, etc. And so this question strategy that I just call it pulling the thread, which is just, once they say something, just to say more. What else do you have to say? What other thought, is there more to that? And just continuing to draw them out increases the chances that we're going to actually get to the thing that they would have said when they're on their way out the door, if they would have said it at all. And in my own leadership, when I talk with team members who are either expressing concerns to me about something going on, in our work or on the team, or who are sharing ideas with me, I will often say to them, "That's great, thank you for sharing that. What else? What else? Is there more?" And I sometimes I'll literally say, by the way, and each time I say what else, they say something even more interesting or more important or more insightful. And sometimes I'll say to them that, that was really interesting. I'm just going to keep saying to you what else until you tell me I'm done. And I'll say it 3 or 4 more times and more stuff will come out. And finally they'll say, okay, I think that's all I got. But had I not asked all those additional, what else you got, what more, etc., I would have you probably had the least interesting thing that they would have had to say.
Yeah, and it's some people, including myself, are like, well, how do I do that and not be, invasive,
Yes.
or something like that? And so I love that strategy of just pulling the thread and just saying, well, what else? What else do you have to say about that? Because sometimes if someone says something, I don't know if I should. Maybe it's personal, and
Right.
I shouldn't ask it anything else on that topic.
And sometimes when I do sense that there might be some hesitation, I will also say, I'm going to ask you what else, but at any point, just stop if you feel like that's all there is to say, or that's all you want to share. And that's completely fine too, just to make it safer to be able for people to regulate their boundaries as well.
Yeah, and you're almost asking permission along the way, and you're just being upfront. Like, I'm going to keep saying this, and because if you did it, maybe and didn't say that, they're like, why does he keep repeating?
Why does he
what
keep
else?
probing me? Yeah,
And you're stating up front, and giving them permission to say when you're done, or if you're not comfortable, you're not comfortable. So yeah, I love that. And the next is reflect and reconnect.
Yeah.
And there was a time where you actually you were growing quickly and you got feedback from the team. I don't know if you want to talk about
I'll share about it.
that
Yeah.
example.
So reflect and reconnect is, I think, my favorite of the 5 steps, the 5 practices of the ask approach. Partly because I'm a nerd and junkie just on learning, and any kind of learning. And reflect and reconnect is really how we squeeze the learning out of a conversation. Even if we ask a great question and we listen well, there's a question of like, are we going to do something with that? Are we going to make meaning of it? And so reflecting, which I think sometimes gets a bad rap. Sometimes people think, well, reflecting is just something that, is very esoteric. I have to be on a meditation retreat to reflect. But what I talk about is that reflecting is very concrete and very practical. First of all, it's just sifting, what does someone say? What's the part of what they said that's useful? What's the part I can let go? And then just turning it through a couple of questions to say, how does what they say affect my story? How does what they say affect the steps that I should take? Is there anything that I heard that kind of challenges or pushes my deeper stuff, my deeper assumptions about the world, et cetera? And you can just kind of concretely walk through these questions, whether you do it on your own in the shower, whether you do it in a journal, whether you do it with a coach, whether you do it with a friend. There's a bunch of different ways that you can make reflection very simple and practical. And then the last part of that is to go back to the other person and reconnect and say to them, here's what I learned from what you shared, and thank you. And did I get it right? And that kind of closing the loop makes a huge difference, because it lets people know, A, they didn't waste their time, B, you really value them, and C, it's worth doing again in the future. And so that reconnecting matters. And so the story that you were referencing is a story where my partner, Elon, and I had received a bunch of feedback from the team a couple years ago, about some pain that team members were experiencing because we grew quickly and hadn't put all of the systems and structures in place that one would need to be at the new scale that we were at. And this was coming out of COVID, and we had a huge amount of demand from schools and systems to work with them. And we wanted to kind of like meet that demand and support communities where they were at a very difficult time. And so we hired a bunch more people. We took on a bunch of projects to try to have that positive impact, which we did, but it came at a cost to a bunch of team members. And so we had done a bunch of listening, heard a bunch of feedback. Elon and I reflected, and then at our annual retreat, where we had 100 plus people together, Elon and I were kind of up on stage. We had our colleague, Janae Henry Wood, who's our chief learning officer, interview us. And she basically said, can you share with us, what did you learn? What mistakes did you make? And why did you make those mistakes? And then why did you do the thing that led to that? And really kind of took us pretty far back into our stuff, to the point where Elon was talking about his relationship with his mother, and I was talking about my dad, and how my dad how my dad influenced me to be thinking what's the problem, and always be paranoid, and just got to a very deep level of I think of honesty and vulnerability with 100 people watching and listening. And I was just staring down thinking, why am I saying this? And I can't believe they're going to, they're going to completely lose confidence in us as leaders, having now not only admitted that we made a mistake, but also talked about all of the vulnerabilities that led us to make that mistake. But instead I looked up, and people literally stood up and did a standing ovation. And they said, can we do this every year? Because this is so powerful to see leaders of an organization be willing to publicly reflect, particularly around something that's hard. And it says to us, we can do that ourselves too. And so we then followed that with a session where we said to people, now everyone find a partner and have a similar conversation about something that you learned. And it just opened up a level of kind of openness and transparency that I think wouldn't have happened had we not reconnected with people on what we had reflected on.
It sounds like that session was almost taking people through the question mark, which was
Exactly.
like to choose curiosity, because all those things that you were sharing sound like it made them probably make it safe environment. They posed the quality questions, and then you were reflecting and almost publicly taking someone through the whole scenario.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. And I think it's an example of how this work can operate, not just at a one-on-one conversation, but also at a team and organizational level, and the important role that leaders play in setting the tone that's important and possible to do.
What do you remember sharing that was uncomfortable there? Because I find even with these sessions, some people will share something that it makes them vulnerable. And those are usually the best things that people talk about. And that's what people learn about. That's what people remember?
Yes.
Do you remember from the audience perspective there what stuck out to them on what you said
I think it
that
was two
day?
things. I think some of it was literally just naming them that we made a mistake and then saying, here's what led us to overlook the need to build those systems, even when some of you were telling us at the time that you need to build those systems. So some of it was kind of personal ownership and accountability. But then some of it was also where Elon and I were able to reflect out loud around our relationship with each other and the dynamics of our relationship and the ways in which, my paranoia would potentially be too much that would lead him to sort of say like, wait a minute, it's going to be okay. We don't need to, completely get paranoid about. And so there was learning for Elon and I in our relationship that I think is very rare for people to talk about, even just between the two of them, let alone to say publicly to a group of people that you're supposedly leading. And I think people really, really responded to that.
So sharing the dynamic maybe they weren't as familiar with, and that
Right.
dynamic came from maybe deep-seated stuff that came from growing up.
Yes. And maybe maybe it was even a dynamic that they had kind of intuited or had a sense of themselves, but to actually hear us just talk openly about it felt, I think, unusual.
Yeah, and I sometimes learn the hard way and slowly, and so I really resonate with the reflect and connect, and even with clients from an email perspective, we've in the past, thought we understood what the person wanted, and then we went off and did whatever we thought, and it was not correct. And so, like,
Hmm.
we'll do this via email now much better, and just reflecting back to here's what we think you're asking and all the things. And so it's important. A lot of times it's like, oh, well, this is right, but this, and this is not actually what we want. So
Exactly.
that reflect and connect has been so critical for us to just remember to do it, even via email.
Yes, totally. And what you're illustrating starts with a strategy that I have under listen to learn, which is what is paraphrase and test. Paraphrasing back. Here's what I think I heard you say. Let me test. Did I get it right? And so often we don't get it right the first time, and that's okay. But if we give ourselves the chance to test it, then they can correct what we have to say. Not only do we avoid wasting time or making mistakes, to your point, but we also let them know that that sends a message to them like it's important to me to know what you have to say. And sometimes that leads them to say more that they hadn't originally said.
I feel that, and I noticed this, some of the best wait staff I've had do the same thing. Like, I'm
Hmm.
wondering, I gave you all these modifications. There's no way they're going to remember it, but the ones that actually repeat it back, I'm like, okay, I'm obviously confident,
Totally.
with that. So
Great example.
yeah. Talk about Wendy Kopp for a second. I know you worked at Teach for America for 10 years, and she wrote a glowing, uh, you know, testimonial excerpt for your book. What are some things you learned from Wendy at Teach for America?
So Wendy was actually a client of mine when I was in consulting for 5 years before I joined Teach for America. And then she hired me to help run part of the organization. And I remember my very first day on the job. Um, I went to her office and I said to Wendy, you have seen a lot of people come and go here. You've seen some people be successful. You've seen some people not be successful. What makes the difference? What would your advice be to me as I'm a new leader in the organization? And she said, Jeff, when people are not successful here, it's because they think they have to put on an air or a veneer of having it all figured out, having it all together. But you're going to struggle. You're going to have challenges. We're doing really hard but important work. And that means it's not going to always go well. And so my advice to you is don't act like you have it all together when you feel like you don't. And instead tell people what you're struggling with and ask for help, and ask questions when you don't know the answer. And in many ways, I think that her advice is literally the heart of the book, which is to tap into the wisdom that other people can offer you. But that was the very first piece of advice she ever gave me, and it has always stuck with me.
Jeff, I'm going to share. It's really, I mean, I encourage everyone to check out askapproach.com, get the book, check it out. There's so many leaders that have written amazing praise about the book. And I'm wondering which one surprised you the most, from who responded. I mean, these are busy people. And if you're watching the video, you could see we have Kim Scott of Radical Candor. We have Adam Grant of, he's so many books. Mine, Give and Take, is one of my favorites of his. We have so many people. Jim Collins of Good to Great. The CEO, former chair and CEO of Kraft Foods. Which one of these surprised you when you got back a quote for the book?
Well, that's a really interesting question. You can pause right there because I'll speak to Parker Palmer. I don't know if everybody knows who Parker Palmer is, but he's an incredible leader. He's an activist. He's an educator. He's really transcended many different fields. And he ended his quote by saying, "Here's a book that points the way to a larger life." And I thought to myself, wow, I never would have thought of this as pointing the way to a larger life. But when I sat with it, I thought about it, I thought to myself, I think that's right, because asking questions and tapping into other people's wisdom essentially gives us visibility and into their worlds and lets us kind of inhabit many, many other worlds that's different than our own reality. And so that was a particularly meaningful part of his endorsement.
I love it. I want to just thank you, Jeff, for sharing your knowledge or wisdom. And it takes a lot of time, energy to pour into a book. So thanks for creating that. Everyone can check out askapproach.com to learn more. And we'll see everyone next time. Jeff, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Really enjoyed the conversation.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like 100 grand.